Welcome, everybody. We are back for another one of your questions about work. And this is a special one because I have as a guest someone who I ask many of my questions about work, who is Carole Robin, who, in addition to being quietly the coach to many of the founders, investors, executives whose names you would recognize, also co-created at Stanford a now legendary program called Touchy Feely, where business school students learn about the value of relationships. And she's got a book that's out, which we'll talk about in a minute. But let's just jump in for the question today, day 153, which is a tough one, which is I've got a colleague, whether it's a boss or a coworker, or somebody who's doing something that I just can't stand, that's really awful. And oftentimes people just bottle that in and they don't know what to do about it. And so should I tell them? How should I handle that, Carole?
So let's start with, if I'm doing something, if you and I work together and I'm doing something that bugs you, am I better off knowing or not knowing?
You're better off knowing.
Okay. So let's start with that.
I may not be better off with you knowing, but you're for sure better off knowing.
But if I am better off and I know that your intent in telling me is for me to be better off, aren't we likely to get started down a better path?
Yeah, I love that. So that first thing of like, if the intent is to serve the other person.
Correct. So that's rule number one, a mental model that I actually have data for you that might be useful to you. Now, you may decide it's not useful, but who am I to decide it's not useful? So let's start with human beings are intentional animals. And when I do something, I am hoping to get a particular outcome. But only you know whether my desired outcome is actually what I achieved. So let's start there. Now, the reason that a lot of these kinds of conversations go terribly awry, because they do. And as Mark Twain once said, a cat never sits on a hot stove twice, but it also never sits on a cold stove again, is that I try to give you a little feedback or I try to name something that's problematic. It goes badly. And so then I think, well, that didn't go well. So then I stop doing it. So then I don't get any better at doing it. So every interaction with another human being is a potential to learn. It's a potential to learn about ourselves. It's a potential to learn about them. And it's certainly a potential to learn about the relationship. Now, there's a whole course that we taught and a whole book that I've written on how to have those conversations in ways that they're more likely to go better. No guarantees, but we're going to shift the probabilities that the conversation is going to go better.
All right. And so I shift the probability, but how do I judge? I mean, oftentimes what happens is the person who wants to say something feels they have less power than the person with whom they want to say something to. They are, and I'm thinking like literally Monday, I was just saying in our team meeting, one of our teammates basically said to me, like, do you want to hear me finish my thought or not? Because I interrupted him, as I often do, unfortunately.
Yes.
And like, no, I wanted to hear him finish his thought. And so that worked and didn't harm my relationship with him. But I could very easily see being in a situation where I'm like, gosh, that person was insert pejorative word here. And so if you're the person who is in a position of having less power,
yes,
how do you judge whether it's worth the risk to say something to a person who has more power than you do?
Well, let's start with information is power. So if I know something that is potentially useful to you,
sure,
I actually have more power than I may realize. Okay. Now, how I say it to you matters. And power differentials definitely matter. Now, let's take your example. Let's say that I feel very much many steps down from you, and I'm afraid to say something to you. But I know that the more you interrupt me, the less likely I am to speak up. And if you want me to speak up, that's probably something important for you to know.
Sure.
Now, I might not say something to you in the middle of the meeting.
Sure.
But I might come to you later and say, Roy, you started that meeting by saying you wanted to hear from everyone. I want you to know that you interrupted me 4 times. Like, be behaviorally specific. You interrupted me when I started with this, this, and this. When you did that, I was less inclined to offer up my opinion. And I don't know that that serves your intention. You wanted to hear from me. And I'm only sharing this with you because you said that's what you wanted. Now, I can also include, is there something I'm doing that's making it hard to wait until I'm finished?
Mm-hmm.
So part of the problem, the part of the reason so much feedback is poorly done is A, people aren't behaviorally specific. B, they don't stay on their side of the net, which is a whole model that we probably don't have time to go into. But essentially, they don't stick with their reaction.
What they can know.
What they know, their reaction, and they make up stories about why you're doing it,
Sure.
Which only makes you defensive. But 3, they think it's just bleh. Let me just tell you, bleh. Feedback should start a problem-solving conversation. It is not, the intention of feedback should not be to change somebody. It should be to say, hey, something here isn't working. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, I've obviously hearing that so many themes that we've talked about over the years. I also think there's a responsibility on those who are in power to try to create the conditions where folks are willing to talk to them. And I'm conscious of the fact that giving feedback to me may be very difficult because,
Yep.
It might be defensive at first, and I would like to try to make it easier. And the other thing that I'll just offer is, you may be sitting there with every technique in the book that you can imagine on how to do a textbook, good feedback conversation to somebody who has more power over you. And I'll just state the obvious, which is I can't empathize. As a white man, there are also plenty of power differentials that have to do with race or gender or something else that I can't fully relate to. But if you're in a work environment where after thinking about how to do it in the best possible way, you still don't think it's worth the risk to do it, it's at least worth asking yourself, is that the right work environment to be in for you? Because that doesn't sound like a very healthy and productive work environment to be in.
So I'll do a yes and. When somebody says to me, I don't know if it's worth it, I ask them to substitute the pronoun. I don't know if I'm worth it. I don't know if you're worth it.
Right.
I don't know if we're worth it. Then ask yourself the question again.
Yeah.
So that's a build on what you just said.
Totally. It's a beautiful way to think about it.
I also think that a lot of people disempower themselves even more. People in lower power positions disempower themselves by holding a mental model that they don't have any power or as much power. They may have less, but they have some. And I don't know if we have time for a very quick story, but years ago,
we love stories.
Years ago, when I was, I've had many careers. I was a consultant. I was one of the partners in a big consulting firm. We all had different jobs. I was in charge of business development. I just told this story at a podcast earlier. We had a person who, a woman, Cindy, who ran our production department, i.e. all the slides and fancy things that we put in front of customers. I was notorious for coming in and saying, oh, Cindy, can you please turn this into a beautiful deck at the last minute? Now, we had all decided, the partners and we'd all created a whole process for how you're supposed to submit something, which I was always doing an end run on. So I come in one day and I say, Cindy, please, I've got a big presentation for Salesforce tomorrow. Can you please throw this together for me and make it pretty? She said, so Carole, you do this all. And by the way, I'd send her flowers and chocolates and, Starbucks certificates. And after a while, there wasn't enough of that to make up for my behavior. Now let's think about this for a moment. I'm the partner, I'm the PhD. She's several rungs down and she never finished college. But when I come in and say, Cindy, here's something else again, she holds it by the corner like this and says, okay, Carole, I will turn this into a beautiful deck for you one more time. If you will promise that from now on, you will actually follow the process that you and the partners agreed to. Now, who had all the power in that moment?
Sure. You know, the line from Few Good Men, her tactical command superseded your rank.
What was I going to say? No, I won't promise. And then, by the
Yeah,
way,
of
I'm a
course.
person of my word. And then I followed the deal,
I
right?
love
And what was I going to do? Fire her for insubordination and then tell my partners that I fired the best person we'd ever had in the job because she dared to ask that I follow something we'd all agreed to?
Well, I mean, to be fair, you are reasonable. I think there are plenty of people who would, that for whom that would be a career limiting move in the real politic of workplaces.
And then you have to ask yourself whether that's where you want to work.
Whether you're worth it, whether they're worth it. Yeah, totally. And I think we could have a whole other conversation, which maybe we'll save for another day, on what are ways to act with power when you perceive yourself to be in a lower power role. Because I've seen
that is a whole other conversation.
It's like power for the job you want kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right, Carole, thank you.
Let me just say one last thing.
Please.
The original question. If you're doing something that's really bugging me and I don't say anything, I am essentially saying it's fine for you to keep doing it.
Yes. I agree.
It's another version of silence is collusion.
Totally agreed. Totally agreed. Easier said than done, but that's why we're here, is to practice the skill.
Exactly.
All right. So it's not advice because we're not telling you what you should do. We're just sharing the experiences that we have. Although in Carole's case, I think she's actually qualified to give the advice. And thank you, Carole, to many more times.
Thank you.